and we're going to dive into chapter 6, and we're just going to be looking at chapter 6, verses 1 through 24. But there's a lot of really neat things happening here, and so we're just going to dive straight into chapter 6, starting with the first verse. And as always, as we're reading, think about things that jump out at you, that you like, that you cause more questions or anything like that, just anything that piques your interest, whether positively or negatively. And so we begin reading this. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. And Jesus went up to the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when Jesus looked up, he saw a large crowd coming toward him. Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus said this to test Philip, for Jesus himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered Jesus, 6 wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. And one of his disciples, named Andrew, this is Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there is a great deal of grass in the place. So they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew to the mountain by himself. When the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into a boat, and they started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because of a strong wind blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. And they were terrified. Jesus said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there. They also saw that Jesus had not gotten into the boat, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Then some of the boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they themselves got into the boat and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Oh, I think I want to end there. Yes, I want to end at 24. Okay, so we ended at 24. Tell me what stands out to you in this reading, or is this a familiar text or a new text?
Very, very familiar, yeah.
Very familiar.
I've always wondered why they only had men at that meeting.
What you mean?
Well, that would have been the convention for numbering. That doesn't necessarily mean it was only men. It just means that that's how they took the count.
Okay.
So there probably were women and children there too.
But not important enough to be counted.
I didn't. But good point. Good point. Well said, Ophelia.
Let me go back to where we started.
Well, we're going to start walking through these 2 kind of stacked miracles, and it's setting up a greater thing. So just a real quick overview of chapter 6. This begins kind of a new narrative cycle. We've been in one narrative cycle, kind of our first narrative cycle, And now we're starting a new one. That first narrative cycle was from chapter 2, starting in chapter 2 and ending with chapter 5. So it's really our first narrative cycle. This starts a new narrative cycle that in many ways is going to kind of repeat and replay a lot of what we have seen in that first narrative cycle. There's a lot of mirroring. And this is just kind of a reminder that this is an account of Jesus's life. And if you're paying attention on Sunday, you heard me say that line in John, this is just some of what we know. We're just giving you what we think you need. But this is a curated story, right? Somebody is crafting a story to tell us. And that doesn't necessitate a nefarious reason. It's just that this is not, so here are the events. I'm just going to list them, just the facts, right? This is a crafted story for Jesus. Notice that the first two miracles in John chapter 2, we read about the water into wine at the wedding. And here our first miracle is the feeding of the multitudes. In both of these inaugural miracles or signs for John's language, notice that Jesus is taking something and changing it, whether water to wine or some bread to a lot of bread, but taking something that is already there and existing and creating it with an abundance. Remember when we looked at the water jars pictures, we talked about how big they were and how much water was in them. There's a lot of emphasis on that. And that was to really kind of communicate this sense of Jesus making way more wine than was necessary. And here we see Jesus making way more bread than is necessary, right? So much so that they fill up 12 baskets worth of the leftovers. And it's interesting that in both of these inaugural things, the first one, wine, the second, bread, whenever Christians come together and we talk about wine and bread, what does that make us think of?
Communion.
It makes us think of Holy Communion. So you have this kind of sacramental thing happening here, even though communion is not in these miracles, in these signs. And when we get to the Last Supper, the night before Jesus is arrested, you'll remember in John's Gospel, there is not breaking of the bread and the raising of the cup. There's the washing of the feet. And so it's almost like communion is spread across John's Gospel as opposed to this pinpointed moment as it is in the Synoptics. And then right after that inaugural miracle or sign, Jesus then has this kind of revelatory sign. We see that in chapter 2, verse 11, with the wedding and the miracle of Cana. And here we see it with the walking on the Sea of Galilee. And interestingly, too, each narrative cycle ends with a healing narrative. We saw that in chapter 5, with the healing of the paralyzed man at the water. And we'll see that with the healing of the man born blind from birth in chapter 9. And both of those healings will spark immense controversy with religious leadership. There is, I will say, if you ever are reading commentaries on this part, but you don't need to read commentaries after you've gone through this study of John. I mean, you're done. But if you do read commentaries, you'll see some commentators will say that you really should switch chapters 5 and 6. That maybe chapter 6 happened before chapter 5, and somehow these chapters got switched over time. I'm not a proponent of that understanding. The major reason for that is, if you remember at the end of chapter 5, Jesus is in Jerusalem. Now he's in Galilee. We're going to quickly see him go back to Jerusalem for Passover. There's no evidence to really switch these two chapters. We don't have a copy of John where they're switched. It's just some scholars tend to see that Jesus is moving too quickly between these geographic locations, and then it makes, for some people, more sense for these two to be switched. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. I don't espouse that position. So in chapter 6, the whole chapter, which is 71 verses, it's a massive chapter. It actually kind of loosely mimics chapter 5 with this notion of a miracle and then a dialogue and a discourse, right? We had the healing of the man, then we had Jesus kind of being in dialogue with the religious leadership, and then Jesus goes into a full-on discourse. We'll see that here, but it's kind of six is compounded because we have a double miracle. We have the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water. We get our transition, which we read in 22 through 24. When we come back, we'll dive into the dialogue and the discourse that occurs as well. And then kind of a final conclusion. And it's interesting, the first miracle, the feeding of 5,000, is public. Everybody sees it. The second sign or miracle is for just disciples alone. Then the dialogue is for the crowd. The discourse is for the crowd and disciples. And then their concluding remarks that are just for the disciples alone. So throughout our chapter 6, we have an audience changing and shifting. And that is something to kind of take note as we're looking at all this. So let's dive into this kind of first section, this first miracle. This is the feeding of the 5,000. Fun fact, this is the only miracle or sign that all four Gospels share. This is the only miracle or sign that you can read about in every single Gospel. Matthew and Mark even tell about this miracle twice. They change the numbers, but so either Jesus does it twice or it's a retelling of the story. But this, so in the four Gospels, this miracle or sign is spoken about 6 times. Let that sink in. Jesus doesn't even institute communion 6 times, right? Just 3. The crucifixion of Jesus is talked about 4 times. This miracle is talked about in some form or fashion 6 times.
I know that.
That's because, and can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So let that sink in. This is a big moment. This story was wildly popular in early Christianity. Early churches really focused on this imagery. Loaves and fishes are throughout mosaics. This is a pretty big moment for early Christians as well. So we not only see that fact in scripture, but we see that in how the early churches, in their art and in their liturgy. Interestingly, throughout the Gospels, though, each Gospel tells the story a little bit differently. Now, the Synoptic Gospels, remember when we talk about the Gospels, we kind of think of this adage, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're up here. John is down here. John is not a synoptic. And sometimes it's called the fourth Gospel. John's different. So in the Synoptics, this scene kind of plays out a lot like Holy Communion. Jesus takes the bread, blesses the bread, breaks the bread, and then it's distributed by the disciples and the apostles to all the people. That doesn't happen here, or it's not as emphasized here. In John's Gospel, the action really is placed on how Jesus is the gift of bread. And we'll note another change in that in the Synoptic Gospels, the apostles distributed the bread, but in this telling of the story of the sign, it is Jesus himself who distributes the bread among all of the people. So verses 1 through 4, it's an introduction to the sign. It's establishing where we are. We're at the Sea of Galilee. There's a big crowd because of all the signs. Jesus is on a mountain. It's around the Passover. And whenever we think of Passover, we're thinking of that unleavened bread on the night of Passover. We also are thinking of the manna that God provides to the Israelites in the wilderness. So bread is really important in these stories. Verses 5 to 15, we really get the by anticipating the hunger of the crowd. Notice nobody comes to Jesus and says, hey, they're hungry. That happens in the Synoptics. But here it's like Jesus is like, I think these people are going to be hungry. We also have that with the healing of the paralyzed man at the pool. Remember, nobody asked Jesus for healing. The initiative lies within him and nowhere else. This question to Philip kind of reiterates the control and the knowledge that Jesus Remember, John has a really high understanding of Jesus, a high Christology. And this question from Jesus sparks a very conventional thinking about money. They're thinking about the amount of food. And this discussion really even heightens the daunting size of 6 months' wages to even do this for people to get a little bit, right? This is a big thing to do. And Andrew introduces a new character. None of the synoptics do we have this kind of random boy. But here, Andrew says, we got this kid here. He's got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And this story is full of numbers, right? Whenever we get numbers in the Bible, there's typically something is happening there. We don't know why it's 5 loaves and 2 fish, but you add those up and we get 7, right? 7 days of the week. This notion of 7 days of creation. This is a notion that this kid has enough or a complete amount of something. But anyway, this kid is new, and Jesus takes what this kid has and uses it to do something great. Just like Jesus takes the stone jars of water and makes wine. So he's taking something already present and using that as a sign for the basis of the sign. And Jesus distributes this meal himself, unlike the synoptics and the disciples do it. And after feeding this, we have how many baskets? Important, we say 12 baskets, right? And 12 also is a very biblical number. We have 12 apostles. We have 12 tribes of Israel. So 12 also kind of has this nice kind of complete feeling to it. 12 baskets. And this points to the abundance that this sign miracle produces, just like with the wine. And because of this, the people say, hey, this is the prophet of the world to come. And that really kind of puts us right back to the last chapter when Jesus talks about how Moses himself will kind of judge the people for not seeing what Scripture itself has said will happen, and that's the coming prophet to come, and harkens back to when the Israelites in the wilderness try to make Moses into a king, and he declines it. And so there's a lot happening here. So just in the feeding of the 5,000, what is this making you think? There's a lot happening here.
I'm just impressed with how smart my husband is.
Somebody.
You can tell them I said that.
I'm glad. I don't think they can hear you. I'm glad they can hear you. So tell me what y'all are thinking. I mean, there's a lot of differences here. You have the boy, you have Jesus doing it himself. You don't have this, you've got a lot of interesting things happening here. I think that we tend to just think about, all right, got a lot of people, but a lot is being communicated here. Why do you think and of course it's always dangerous whenever we try to think of what somebody else is thinking. What power is lent to the fact that there's a young boy who has the resources for this sign miracle? And it's not just from something an unnamed source, but here we see it's a young boy who has, this kid's lunch is the basis for this sign miracle. What does that make you? How does that change the story for you?
Well, it reminds me of the verse, let the children come unto me. Children are important.
Yeah, it's a cross-generational thing, right? If it weren't for a young boy being allowed to even, it tells us to, in some ways, Gene, to bounce off of that, to look at the resources that our children bring to bear to our community of faith. I think you can even make it a little bit broader. How often have we had a 5,000 men, probably even more people problem at church, and we've looked and said, gosh, I would love to solve that problem, but all I've got are 5 loaves and 2 fish. Yeah. To me, it reminds me of whenever I think I just have a little bit that I can give. If this kid coughs up his lunch, right? But because of his willingness to give the little bit of food that he has, everyone gets something to eat. That's a very powerful thing. There's a huge power in adding that character to the story, or John making sure that that character is highlighted. That doesn't mean that this character wasn't in all the stories, but maybe the other gospel writers didn't see the importance of this. But for John, this needed to get brought up. This was something that was being neglected. Remember, John maybe has the hindsight of seeing other gospels have already being written, or at least the oral tradition that preceded them getting around. I think there's a lot of power in that.
I've always wondered if the boy offered his lunch or if they saw that he had it.
Yeah, that's kind of that St. Ignatius sacred imagination, dropping yourself in the story. I would like to think that if I were the boy, I would have given my 5 loaves and 2 fish over, as opposed to, Andrew being like, give me that. But, I think that you pair this miracle with the wine, you get this Eucharistic image. You pair this miracle with the wine and that sense of, Jesus taking what we have and doing something, taking the ordinary thing that we have, stone jars for purification. Every house would have had that. Some bread and fish. Any kid in Galilee would have some bread, some barley loaves, and some fish. And Jesus takes our ordinary and does something extraordinary with it when we give that to Jesus. And so I think that is a really beautiful thing to pull from this. The second part of this is 16 through 21, and it's this walking on water. Now in Matthew and Mark, not Luke, and Matthew and Mark and John, right after the feeding and miracle, is always followed by walking on water. These things are somehow always tethered together. You always have feeding 5,000, and you always have walking on water happen right after that, except they're in Luke. And in the synoptics, the story, this is interesting, and we've done this a couple of times. I want you to think of like you're making a movie, okay? So we have the camera shot, we have that great scene of so many people eating food, and we have the close-up on the baskets, 12 baskets left over, and then we have the next shot. Well, in the synoptics, the camera follows Jesus away. We even have that scene of Jesus in the synoptics. Jesus is looking over the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias, and sees the boat from a distance. In John's gospel, the camera doesn't go with Jesus. The camera follows the disciples and gets in the boat with them. That's a unique thing that John's gospel does. So we get this action from the disciples' vantage point, not from Jesus's. And since the action is with the disciples, there's no advance notice of what they're about to see, save for the line that we get in the midst of this, that Jesus had not come to them yet. It's setting up the fact, it's reminding us Jesus is not with them. And then all of a sudden, boom, on the water is this figure. And the reader is meant to be startled as much as the disciples are in the story. And in all the accounts, Christ tells them not to fear. This, do not fear, it is I. That is across the 3 accounts of the walking on the water. And here that it is I am here. You have this kind of recitation of an I am statement with Jesus kind of revealing himself, showing that it's him. It takes on a different context in John because of the I am statements that are peppered throughout John, right? You think of Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman saying, you know, there's somebody coming who's going to give you living water. And she says, oh, we know that there's a Messiah, the anointed one that's coming. And what does Jesus say? I am he. So we have here Jesus. So we have this revelation. You get to see who Jesus is whenever you have Jesus saying, I am, right? Not just in those 9 kind of, I am the true vine, I am the light. But we have it throughout I am statements with Nicodemus, the Samaritan woman, throughout that. And remember from our last week's study on what Jesus is teaching us about the Trinity, whenever we have a statement of Jesus saying, I am, that is also a statement of the whole Trinity, the whole Godhead, because whatever Jesus is the revelation of what the Father and the Spirit are. And so this is just a moment of not only Jesus revealing a little more of himself, the power to walk across water. And this really goes back to the Genesis text of, in the beginning, you know, the earth was formless and void, and the waters of chaos were just swirling around, and the Spirit of God came and hovered, you know, kind of almost that walking upon image of, you know, the waters of chaos are being controlled by the Creator and forming the dry land and the beginning creation. You know, Jesus walking on water is not just a parlor trick or something cool that's happening here. It is a statement of God's authority and power. And that is why, and so when Jesus is doing this, it's supposed to kind of point us back to and remind us of, in the beginning was God, when the darkness and the chaos, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's reminding us that this Jesus is not something that's just been around for a little bit of time, but it harkens us back to the waters of creation. And in that, we get the revelation of who Jesus is. And this I am statement also points to, you can read it in Isaiah 43, 51, 52, this kind of bouncing off of the divine name of who this person is, who the divine is, a theophany, as it's called, always paired with words of comfort to not fear. You know, I'm reminded of all commands Jesus gives to us in the Gospels. Of all the commands Jesus gives to us in the Gospels, what's the most frequent command Jesus gives to his followers? Fear not. That's the most we get. Fear not. Out of all the things Jesus tells the followers to do, the first thing Jesus, the command with the most frequency is to not fear. And we get that again here. We get that paired with the God who created the heavens and the earth, walking on the back of the chaos, saying, do not fear. I love how John ends. In most of the stories, you know, we get the one with Peter going, right? We don't get that here. But in all of them, Jesus, you know, comes back on the boat and they keep on sailing. I love it how John does not care about what happens after this moment, right? What happens in this story? After this revelation, it's as though somebody punches the fast forward button on the remote, because they just zip over in there in Capernaum. It doesn't matter. We don't get Jesus getting on the boat. We don't get an after moment conversation. We don't get any of that. We just get, okay, we're done with that. We're in Capernaum. So sometimes it's interesting to see, what does the Bible lift up, or you know, this new thing with the boy, or all of this stuff. And here, when does the Bible kind of skip over stuff and say, we're good? And here's this moment where John's gospel is like, we don't care about this. We want to get to Capernaum now, because in Capernaum, this is where all of this, the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on the water, all of this gets unpacked for the religious authorities and the dialogue and the crowd and the disciples, and it gets explained there. And so verses 22 through 24, these are transition verses. They just get the players in the right place. We get the crowd moves back over. The crowd's in confusion. They come back over. They realize there's a lot of this, like, hang on, there was one boat, but they're separated. How did they both get over there? Which kind of points to the fact that the crowd was not privy to this revelatory sign of walking on the water. But what 22 through 24 gets us is, okay, so everybody who's experienced what just happened, right? The crowd with the feeding of the crowd of the disciples with the feeding of the 5,000, and the disciples with the walking on the water. Everybody has shifted from this part of the shore, and now we're in the city of Capernaum. And now Jesus is going to begin his dialogue, and that's what we're going to dive into next week, is the dialogue and the discourse and the conclusion. So tell me what your thoughts are of these two sign miracles that, you know, I think if we were going to list, you know, tell me the top 10 sign miracles of Jesus, I think that these two would make it on the list, right? You know, raising Lazarus from the dead, we'll get to that. Water to wine, but these two are pretty popular. But notice they are getting kind of told in a new way. And so you have to think about, you know, when John makes efforts to not rehash things that we've already listened to, right? So that means John is choosing not to add stories. And it's interesting when we see that John does the exact opposite. It's when John says, oh, I know you've already heard this one. I know it's way out there, but I'm going to tell it to you again. There's some power in that too. What you got, Gene?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to answer your question, but I agree. These two miracles would be among my top 10. But you said something that I really want an answer to, and you might have it. If not, I'll Google. Okay, you said that of all the commandments God has given to us in the Bible, the most frequent was fear not. I never had been told that before. I had no idea. Now, my question is, do we have any idea how many times we are told to fear not?
So the command to fear not can be found throughout Scripture, throughout the Bible, Old, New Testaments. To make sure that I make my statement authentically, and if I misspoke, I apologize. It's the command that Jesus in the Gospels provides to the followers the most.
Okay, so I need to change my word.
Some version of that, but it is the most frequent command that Christ gives, normally to followers. Because remember, Jesus doesn't always speak to followers, right? But normally to followers. But once again, that command to fear not. Well, I mean, you can find God commanding people that throughout Scripture. But I know for a fact in the Gospel, and I don't know the exact number, it is the most frequented commandment Jesus gives the followers.
Well, it made me think about, as a child, often I was told, you better be a little afraid. And it actually instilled respect, is what it did. Not only should I be a little afraid of my parents and grandparents, but also be a little afraid of the Lord, that judgment was coming. But it did instill some respect. But I think about, in the world today, some religions really do stress, I believe, judgment. And I just think it's a beautiful thought that out of all, we are told to fear not repeatedly.
And I mean, someone could retort, Proverbs says the beginning of wisdom and knowledge of the Lord begins with fear, right? So you could have this sense of, we do have judgment in our own understanding, judgment. And in fact, I'll be talking about this tomorrow morning prayer. The parameters for judgment that we might put out there is not the parameters that God puts out there necessarily. I think the question is, do I have a healthy fear of God? You bet I do.
Mhm.
However, if we allow ourselves to be so fearful, we miss, you know, what would have happened if the disciples had been overcome by fear and began paddling away from Jesus?
Right. Mhm.
Right?
Yes.
Fear can grip us to the point of an inability to believe and act. And so, you know, normally when that's happening, it is God moving to humanity and God begging humanity to not recoil from God's presence because a relationship is attempting to be established, right? If we become so afraid of God that we don't allow a relationship with God, well, at the end of the day, we're still not allowed that relationship with God. But no, I think that's something to note. And you could say, well, the problem today is we don't fear God enough. Maybe Jesus would not give that command. Remember, Jesus is giving that command to the people that are there, right? And so, you know, if we were modern day apostles, what would be the number one command Jesus would give to us? Maybe it's listen to me or do it, you know, but that it shows a willingness of God to meet people where they are in an attempt to have that communication and understanding. So what else stands out to you? Well, I want to give you a little bit of homework. Okay, and like all things, you get out of it what you put into it. I would like for you to go through the synoptics and very briefly read, and they're always very short stories, but read Jesus's feeding of the 5,000. Note what piques your interest in each of them, because once again, this is the one miracle sign that is throughout all four Gospels. And note their similarities, note their differences, note what they're trying to communicate. If each one is telling the story, remember the Gospels are curated narratives. That means that when they put that story in, they've thought about how people will read and what's happening around that story. Why does Luke leave out walking on the water? Why does Luke do that? Of course, we don't know the answers to that, but there is intrigue in asking those questions and then diving deeper into the scriptures. But I hope that you've enjoyed these two miracles. I look forward to the dialogue, discourse, and conclusion of Jesus. I will give you a heads up. It's a lot like our last one at the end of the healing of the paralyzed man. Jesus is going to get into theology. That's why it's a nice kind of, just two miracles of feeding 5,000 and walking on water. But let's close our time with a word of prayer. Okay? God, we give you thanks that how you reveal yourself to us and how you reveal yourself, your glory and your graciousness in the feeding of the people, your glory in walking on the water, and helping us know that you control all things, for you are the creator of heaven and earth, and yet you desire to come to us and to give to us eternal and abundant life. And for that, we give you thanks and praise. Help us always to see how you can take our 5 loaves, our 2 fish, and feed the masses. In your name we pray. Amen. Olivia says, hey.
Hello, Olivia.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. Be safe.
Where's